The 60 warriors had access to the king in his most vulnerable moments. They saw Solomon sleeping, waking in informal attire away from public eyes. They knew routines that could never be revealed to strangers. This functional intimacy created a peculiar bond, not exactly friendship, but something perhaps deeper, a mutual dependence where the king entrusted his life to those men and those men dedicated their lives to the king. What would the daily routine of this guard be like? It likely began before sunset, when the night shift took their positions. There was inspection of weapons, verification of every access point, and communication regarding any unusual event occurred during the day. As darkness took hold of Jerusalem, vigilance intensified. Every sound was analyzed. Every movement in the shadows, investigated. The most critical hours were those between midnight and dawn, when sleep weighed heaviest and the temptation to relax attention was greatest. There was no margin for error, a moment of distraction, a guard who slumbered at his post, a door left unguarded for minutes. Any failure could be exploited by enemies who merely awaited the right opportunity. The psychological pressure upon these men was immense. It was not enough to be physically present. It was necessary to maintain constant mental alert for hours on end, night after night, month after month, year after year. How many years did these warriors serve? Solomon's reign lasted 40 years. It is unlikely that the same 60 men served throughout this entire period. Age, injuries, death. Various factors would cause turnover in the guard over the decades. This means there existed a system of continuous recruitment and training to keep the contingent full. Young warriors would be identified, tested, and prepared to eventually assume positions in the royal protection. Tradition passed from one generation to another within the military structure itself. Think of the prestige involved. To be selected for the king's personal guard represented the pinnacle of the military career in Israel. There was no more honorable position for a warrior. Entire families likely took pride in having a member serving among the 60. In the villages and cities from which these men came, their stories would be told and retold as examples of courage and dedication. The social status that accompanied this role certainly attracted the best candidates available. But prestige came with a price. The personal lives of these warriors were necessarily limited. Constant night service made maintaining a normal family life difficult. A prolonged period in Jerusalem meant distance from lands and properties in regions of origin. The commitment to the king's security demanded sacrifices that went far beyond the physical risk of combat. These men surrendered not only their swords, but their very existences to the mission of protecting Solomon. The matter of weaponry deserves analysis. The text mentions swords, but the guard likely carried more complete equipment: shields for defense, possibly spears for long-range combat in corridors, and perhaps daggers as secondary weapons for very close encounters. The specific type of sword used varied at the time, from short blades for enclosed environments to longer swords for open combat. Training would include proficiency in multiple weapons for adaptation to different threat scenarios. Israelite metallurgy of the period was sophisticated. Although iron was already known, bronze was still widely used for quality weapons. The best blades combined enough hardness to maintain a sharp edge with flexibility so as not to break in combat. Specialized artisans produced these weapons, and the royal guard certainly had access to the best equipment available. A sword of inferior quality could mean the difference between life and death in a real confrontation. There was also specific attire. Royal guards in ancient cultures frequently wore uniforms or insignia that identified them. This served multiple purposes: to facilitate recognition among members of the guard itself, to intimidate potential aggressors, and to demonstrate the organization and resources of the kingdom. We do not know exactly how Solomon's 60 warriors dressed, but it is reasonable to imagine some type of standardization that distinguished them from common soldiers. The matter of night feeding was also practical. During long shifts of vigil, the guards needed some form of sustenance without abandoning their posts. There was likely a brief rotation system for meals or foods that could be consumed quickly without compromising readiness. Water was essential. Dehydration affects concentration and reflexes. Small logistical details such as these made a difference in the overall efficiency of the security operation. And what of the communication between the guards? In an extensive palace like Solomon's, coordination was essential. If a threat were detected in one area, others needed to be alerted quickly. Sound signals, visual signals, or messengers running between posts. Some system existed to ensure a coordinated response. An attack that managed to isolate a group of guards from the rest would be much more dangerous than one faced by the full force of the 60. The mathematics of protection is relentless. 60 men divided among multiple shifts, multiple access points, and multiple layers of defense mean that at any specific moment, only a fraction was directly around the king. If each shift lasted 4 to 6 hours, and 3 shifts covered the entire night, there were perhaps 20 active men at a time. Distributed throughout the palace complex, this could mean groups of 3 to 5 guards at each critical point. It was not an army, it was a surgical force, precise and strategically positioned, but it was enough. History records no successful assassination attempt against Solomon. In 40 years of reign, with all the political intrigues, international rivalries, and internal tensions, the king died of natural causes in his bed. The guard fulfilled its mission. The 60 warriors, or rather the successive generations of warriors who occupied those positions, kept their sovereign alive until the natural end of his days. This does not mean there were no attempts. The absence of record does not prove the absence of events. It is possible, perhaps probable, that conspiracies were discovered and neutralized before they came to fruition. Potential assassins were identified and eliminated silently. Plans were intercepted through informants infiltrated in foreign courts. Efficient security is often invisible. We only perceive its importance when it fails. Solomon's guard never failed in a recorded manner, which may indicate precisely their exceptional competence. There was also a psychological dimension to the protection. The mere existence of such a formidable guard discouraged attempts. Any potential conspirator needed to calculate not only how to reach the king, but how to survive the 60 warriors in the process. The probability of success decreased drastically when the target was surrounded by the best combatants of the kingdom. Many conspiracies likely died still in the planning phase when the reality of royal protection became clear. Prevention was as important as reaction. The best security systems do not depend solely on responding to attacks, but on preventing attacks from happening. This involves intelligence, knowledge about potential threats before they materialize. The personal guard likely worked in coordination with other elements of the royal apparatus, spies, informants, and officials who monitored suspicious movements. The protection of the king was a collective effort that went far beyond the 60 visible warriors. The legacy of this structure surpassed Solomon's reign. Later kings of Israel and Judah maintained their own personal guards, following the established model. The idea of elite protection for the monarch became standard. Even after the division of the kingdom, even during periods of decline, the figure of the royal guard remained. When Jerusalem finally fell to Babylon, centuries later, there were still guards defending the last kings of the lineage of David. But all this protection did not save what truly mattered. Solomon died in safety, but his kingdom cracked shortly after. The tensions between northern and southern tribes, accumulated over decades, exploded during the reign of his son Rehoboam. 10 tribes separated, forming the kingdom of Israel in the north. Only Judah and Benjamin remained faithful to the house of David in the south. Everything Solomon built, the magnificent temple, the commercial network, the international fame, began to crumble a generation after his death. The 60 warriors protected the body of the king. They could not protect his legacy. And here the story takes a direction that Solomon's warriors could never have imagined. Centuries later, another king would enter Jerusalem, not mounted on war horses, but on a donkey. Not surrounded by 60 armed warriors, but by 12 fishermen and tax collectors. Not accumulating gold and riches, but declaring that he had nowhere to lay his head. Jesus of Nazareth arrived claiming exactly the throne that Solomon had occupied, the throne of David, promised eternally by God. The difference could not be more dramatic. When the soldiers came to arrest Jesus in Gethsemane, Peter drew a sword. It was a natural reflex to defend the master in the same way the 60 would have defended Solomon. But Jesus ordered Peter to put away the weapon. He declared that he could ask the Father for 12 legions of angels, more than 72,000 celestial creatures, but he would not. The king, who had at his disposal protection infinitely superior to 60 human warriors, voluntarily chose to surrender himself to his enemies. Solomon slept protected by swords. Jesus walked unprotected to a cross. Solomon's wisdom attracted the Queen of Sheba with curiosity about riddles. Jesus' wisdom attracted crowds hungry for eternal truth. Solomon's temple was destroyed twice throughout history. The temple that Jesus promised to rebuild in 3 days, his own body, resurrected and remains alive. The 60 warriors protected a king whose dynasty eventually disappeared. The 12 unarmed disciples spread a message that reached every continent. There is a profound irony in this comparison. Solomon's entire security structure was based on a premise. Power needs protection because power can be taken. But the power that Jesus demonstrated was of a different nature. It could not be taken because it was being freely given. It did not need guards because it did not fear death. It did not depend on swords because it operated in a dimension where swords are irrelevant. The 60 warriors represented the pinnacle of human capacity to protect. Jesus revealed that true security comes from a completely different source. This does not diminish Solomon's warriors. They faithfully fulfilled their mission in the context they were given. They were men of extraordinary courage, dedication, and skill. The structure they maintained was genuinely impressive for its time. But the larger story in which they were inserted, the story of redemption that runs through the entire Bible, was pointing to something beyond protected kings and golden temples. It was pointing to a king who would be protection for others, a temple that would be God himself dwelling among men. Today, 2,000 years later, the 60 warriors remain in the biblical text as a testimony to an extraordinary era. The palace they protected has disappeared. The temple they helped guard was destroyed. The kingdom they served fragmented. But the story they told, of power and vulnerability, of wisdom and necessity, of human glory and its limits, continues to resonate because it points to truths that transcend their original context. When you consider Solomon's guard, you are looking into a mirror of the universal human desire for security. We want protection against what threatens us. We build elaborate systems to ensure our survival. We surround what we value with the best defenses we can create. And yet, in the end, we discover that no amount of armed warriors can protect against the deepest realities of existence, the passing time, the legacies that slip from our hands, and the death that eventually reaches everyone. Solomon, with all his wisdom, understood this in the end. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to him, reflects on the vanity of all human achievements. Vanity of vanities, declares the wise elder, looking back at all his wealth, all his projects, and all his glory. The 60 warriors could not protect him from this conclusion. The accumulated gold could not buy eternal meaning. The built temple could not guarantee the permanent presence of God among a people who strayed. The true guard we all need does not wield metal swords. It is a protection of a different nature, that which comes from a restored relationship with the God who created all things. The 60 warriors protected Solomon's sleep in earthly Jerusalem, but there is a celestial Jerusalem where no protection is necessary because no threat exists. The armed guardians pointed, without knowing, to a reality where the very need for guards will completely disappear. Until then, the image remains powerful. 60 men awake while the world sleeps, ready swords gleaming in the torchlight, eyes scanning shadows for danger. Silent courage that never wavers through the long hours of the night. It is an image of absolute dedication, of unreserved service, of protection that does not count the cost. And if human warriors could offer this to a human king, how much more does the eternal God offer to those who trust in him? Psalm 91 declares that angels are given orders to guard the faithful in all their ways, protection greater than 60 warriors, vigilance more constant than any human shift allows. Solomon's 60 warriors fulfilled their role in history. Now the question is for you. In what are you trusting for your protection? In human systems that, however impressive they may be, eventually fail? Or in the source of security that remains when all else crumbles? The warriors around Solomon's bed were a sign pointing to something greater. You can continue looking at the sign, or you can follow the direction in which it has always pointed. The choice, as always, is yours. To help us continue producing these documentaries and biblical stories, consider purchasing our ebook with more than 50 prayers. It is a way to bless this project and, at the same time, have a spiritual guide for your journey. The link to secure yours is in the description. Until the next video. 60 armed men positioned around the king's chamber while he slept. This was no exaggeration, it was strategy. The Bible reveals little discussed details about a secret guard that transformed the night into absolute vigilance. Who were these giants? Common warriors? Or an elite trained to face invisible threats? Today you will discover what truly existed behind the power and the fear that surrounded Solomon. Subscribe now, because what you are about to hear completely changes the traditional image of the most famous reign in biblical history. Before continuing with the video, do you wish to strengthen your prayer life and also help our channel grow? I have prepared a material with more than 50 special prayers to guide you. Click the link in the description and help our project spread the word of Christ. 10th century before Christ. While Jerusalem sleeps, 60 men remain awake. They are not servants. They are not priests. They are the most lethal warriors Israel has ever produced, and they are positioned around a single chamber. Their swords never return to the scabbard during the night. Their eyes never close before dawn. They protect the man who built the temple of God, who accumulated more gold than any king before him, who transformed a tribal nation into a regional power. The question is, why did someone so powerful need such protection? Think of the scenario for a moment. Jerusalem at the height of Solomon's reign was no ordinary city. It was the political, religious, and economic center of a kingdom that stretched from the Euphrates River to the borders of Egypt. Caravans arrived daily carrying spices from Arabia, gold from Ophir, cedar wood from Lebanon, fabrics from Phoenicia. The port of Etzion-Geber moved vessels that traveled for 3 years before returning with cargoes valued at unimaginable fortunes. Silver was so common in Jerusalem that, according to the record of 1 Kings, it was considered as stones in the streets. The newly built temple shone atop Mount Moriah, covered by gold plates that reflected the desert sun like a beacon visible for miles. It was exactly this wealth that made Solomon a target. Measure the problem the king faced. Every gold coin that entered the royal coffers represented a reason for someone to want to eliminate him. Every commercial alliance created enemies among those who were left out. Every judicial decision generated malcontents who lost disputes. The wisdom that made him famous also multiplied his adversaries. Neighboring kings observed the prosperity of Israel with a mixture of admiration and envy. Princes of nations conquered by David harbored resentments that spanned generations. Even within the palace itself, the politics of a harem with 700 wives and 300 concubines created rival factions vying for influence and position for their children. The night was the most dangerous moment. Not by chance. In antiquity, darkness offered perfect cover for assassins. Without electric lighting, without alarm systems, without instantaneous communication, a well-planned night attack could eliminate a monarch before any help arrived. The history of the ancient Near East is replete with kings killed while they slept. Egyptian pharaohs, Assyrian emperors, Babylonian rulers, many found their end in their own royal chambers, betrayed by servants, bribed guards, or ambitious relatives. Solomon knew these stories. His own father, David, had survived multiple assassination attempts, including a conspiracy led by his own son Absalom. The book of Song of Songs preserves the description of this extraordinary guard. In chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, the text reveals that 60 warriors surrounded Solomon's bed, all chosen from among the most valiant of Israel, all experts in combat, all bearing swords because of the terrors of the night. They were not common soldiers assigned by duty roster. They were the absolute elite of the Israelite army, veterans of battles, men whose reputation had been forged in real combat against real enemies. But how did this protection work in practice? Consider the architecture of Solomon's palace to understand the logistics involved. The royal complex was not a simple construction. 1 Kings chapter 7 describes a project that took 13 years to complete, more time than the construction of the temple itself. The palace included the House of the Forest of Lebanon, a structure supported by 45 cedar pillars distributed in 3 rows, measuring 100 cubits in length by 50 in width. There was also the Porch of Pillars, the Porch of the Throne where Solomon judged cases, and the residential quarters themselves. Each area required specific control points. Each corridor represented a potential access route for invaders. 60 warriors were no exaggeration. They were a mathematical necessity. Imagine the distribution. Some positioned at the external entrances of the residential complex, others controlling the corridors that led to the private quarters, a select group forming the final circle of protection around the royal chamber itself. The system likely worked in shifts, allowing part of the guard to rest while another maintained active vigilance. Even so, readiness was constant. Swords remained unsheathed. Any suspicious movement in the shadows provoked an immediate reaction. The sound of unknown footsteps echoing in the stone corridors would be enough to put dozens of blades in combat position. The training of these men deserves special attention. Israel did not possess formal military academies like those that would emerge centuries later in Rome or Greece. Combat knowledge was transmitted from veteran to apprentice, from father to son, from commander to soldier. The warriors who served in Solomon's personal guard had likely begun their military careers while still young, participating first in auxiliary roles before proving their worth in real confrontations. Many were certainly sons or grandsons of the Gibborim, the mighty men, who had fought alongside David during the decades of wars that consolidated the kingdom. The tradition of the Gibborim deserves to be explored. 2 Samuel and Chronicles list the extraordinary deeds of these warriors. Men who faced Philistine giants alone, commanders who invaded enemy camps at dawn, soldiers who held impossible positions against numerically superior forces. One of them, Benaiah, killed a lion inside a pit on a snowy day. Another, Eleazar, fought against Philistines until his hand became paralyzed, gripping the sword. These were stories that circulated among the Israelite army as examples of what absolute courage meant. Solomon's 60 warriors were heirs to this tradition. It was not enough to be strong. It was not enough to know how to handle a sword. To protect the king, a specific type of loyalty was necessary. That which does not waver before bribery, which does not hesitate before a threat, which does not calculate personal advantages when the monarch's life is at stake. Finding 60 such men in any era of history would be a considerable challenge. In antiquity, when betrayals were routine in royal courts, it was almost miraculous. But there was more than military skill involved. Solomon's personal guard also fulfilled a powerful symbolic function. In the ancient world, kings were not just political leaders. They were representatives of the divine order on earth. The king's security was equivalent to the security of the entire kingdom. A vulnerable monarch suggested a vulnerable kingdom. A well-protected monarch demonstrated a stable, organized kingdom capable of defending its interests. The 60 warriors were, therefore, a living message to any foreign visitor who arrived in Jerusalem, and visitors were not lacking. Solomon's fame attracted delegations from all parts of the known world. The Queen of Sheba traveled more than 2,000 kilometers from southern Arabia to witness personally what she had heard about the wisdom and wealth of the Israelite king. 1 Kings reports that she arrived with a caravan loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones in a quantity never seen again in Israel. Other delegations came from Egypt, Phoenicia, Mesopotamian kingdoms, from nations whose names have been lost to history. All these visitors passed by Solomon's guard. All observed those 60 warriors positioned like lethal statues around the most powerful man in the region. The impression caused was calculated. Consider what a foreign emissary would take back to his own king after visiting Jerusalem. Reports on the wealth of the temple, certainly. Descriptions of the ivory throne covered in gold. numbers regarding the commercial fleet and trade routes, but also, and perhaps primarily, information about the Israelite military capacity, and nothing communicated strength more immediately than 60 elite warriors standing permanent guard around the monarch. Any nation considering attacking Israel would have to calculate not only the regular army but also the exceptional quality of the men closest to the king. There was also the religious dimension. Israel was no ordinary nation. It was, according to its own understanding, a people chosen by God for a specific purpose in history. The king did not rule by his own right, but as a representative of the true king, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Protecting Solomon meant protecting the Davidic lineage through which, according to prophetic promises, blessing would come to all nations. The warriors who stood guard in that palace were not merely fulfilling a military duty. They were, in a way, participating in a greater purpose that transcended politics and earthly power. This did not diminish the practical risks. Biblical history records that Solomon's very birth was already involved in palace intrigue. He was not David's eldest son. Adonijah, his half-brother, attempted to take the throne before David died, forcing a succession crisis that nearly divided the kingdom. Solomon only became king because his mother Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan acted quickly to ensure that David publicly confirmed his choice. Even after the coronation, Adonijah remained a potential threat until he was executed for conspiring again. This familial context explains much about Solomon's mentality. He knew that royal blood did not guarantee loyalty. He had seen firsthand how ambition could destroy family ties. His own father had been persecuted by his father-in-law Saul, betrayed by his son Absalom, challenged by General Joab. The royal court was an environment where smiles hid daggers and alliances shifted as the political wind blew. No amount of wisdom eliminated the need for constant vigilance. The 60 warriors were the practical response to this reality. But who were these men individually? The biblical text does not preserve their names. Unlike David's Gibborim, whose deeds were recorded in detail, Solomon's guardians remain anonymous in the scriptures. We know only that they were valiant among the valiant, experts in the sword, chosen for the highest military service available. Their individual identities merged into a collective function, to protect the king at any cost. This anonymity reveals something important about the nature of the service. The goal was not personal glory, it was absolute efficiency. A guard who sought individual recognition could commit errors motivated by vanity. A guard focused exclusively on the mission would always make the most prudent decision. The 60 functioned as a single organism, each part knowing exactly its role, each man trusting his companions completely. Ego and individualism were luxuries that none of them could afford. Observe the detail about the swords always unsheathed. In practice, this meant that each guard kept his weapon in combat position throughout the entire duty shift. There was no time to draw the blade if an attack occurred. The response had to be instantaneous. Seconds of delay could mean the death of the king. So the swords remained ready, gleaming in the light of the torches that illuminated the palace corridors, creating that visual scene that the Song of Songs captures poetically. Imagine the physical effort involved. Maintaining a sword in combat position for hours on end requires extraordinary muscular endurance. A bronze or iron sword of the time weighed between 1 and 2 kilograms. It seems little, but sustain this weight with your arm extended for 30 minutes and you will understand the challenge. Now multiply by hours of night watch. The 60 warriors not only needed to be skilled in combat, they needed to have the physical conditioning to maintain constant readiness during prolonged periods. This required specific training and adequate nutrition. Unlike common soldiers who received basic rations, the king's personal guard certainly had access to the best resources available. Meat, grains, wine, oil, everything necessary to maintain bodies in peak performance condition. The cost of maintaining 60 elite warriors was considerable, but it represented an investment in security that allowed no economy. What would be the cost of losing the king by trying to reduce expenses on his protection? The location of the royal quarters was also strategic. Ancient palaces were not built thinking only of comfort. They were designed with defense in mind. The king's rooms were generally in the innermost areas of the complex, accessible only through multiple layers of control. Narrow corridors made group attacks difficult. Reinforced doors created additional barriers. Windows, when they existed, were too small to allow the entry of invaders. The entire architectural design collaborated with the work of the guard. Still, the most dangerous threat would not necessarily come from outside. The greatest tragedies of ancient royalty frequently involved internal betrayal. Servants who knew the palace routines, officials with access to the private quarters, relatives with pretensions to the throne. An assassin from within had already bypassed all external barriers even before acting. Therefore, the selection process for the personal guard likely involved deep investigation into the loyalty of each candidate. Family history, tribal connections, possible resentments, financial debts, any factor that could make a man vulnerable to bribery or blackmail needed to be identified and eliminated. Trust was the most valuable currency.